I discovered Violet Vander Elst by mistake. I was researching in my book on the Ruxton murders. There was a fleeting reference to Violet Vander Elst, and I thought, who is this woman? And the more I dug into it, the more I became fascinated, because she's one of these people who has been written out of history. She was driven by this absolute abhorrence of judicial murder, of hanging, of the death penalty, and she set out on a campaign to try and get it eradicated. There's no blue plaque, there's no monument, there's no statue to Violet Vander Elst. What she did was she confronted authority. This little old lady in the Rolls Royce lambasting the policeman or lambasting the Home Secretary or the judge. Of course, that appealed to, a lot of ordinary people who thought, good on you, girl,
Yeah.
Go on.
Tom, I'm excited about today's story that we're going to have a chat about, because like most people out there probably, I knew absolutely nothing about this amazing woman we're going to chat about. You titled this story, "The Magnificent Violet, Britain's Most Dedicated Campaigner." Where did this come from, Tom?
I discovered Violet Vander Elst by mistake. I was researching in my book on the Ruxton murders. There was a fleeting reference to Violet Vander Elst, and I thought, who is this woman? And the more I dug into it, the more I became fascinated, because she's one of these people who has been written out of history. She literally has been airbrushed out of history. And when I started to look at what she did, how she operated, I became fascinated by Violet. And also, I was looking at the current crop of protesters, these people that are sitting blocking the roads and daubing paint on things. And I thought how ineffective they were compared with her. And I thought, I'd like to shine a light on her. I'd like to draw her back out into the light. And I'd really like to ask the question, why, when we're looking for feminist heroes, why is nobody talking about Violet Vander Elst? Why are school children not writing essays about her rather than Emily Pankhurst?
Yeah, especially in this day and age, there's so many role models and protesters from the past that have all the accolades in the world. Why do you think that would be? Was she well covered in the press at the time, Tom? Was it of her day? Was she famous in her day?
Yes, she was very famous in her day, but she was cast as being an eccentric and a nuisance. And the fact that I think she was resented for the fact that she was from a very middle-class background. I mean, she used to turn up at protests in her chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, equipped with a loudspeaker on top of it, in which she used to blare out really, really loud hymns and quotes from the Old Testament. So she was considered to be an eccentric, and I think that's the reason she was airbrushed. Plus, she was confrontational. She confronted the Home Secretary. She confronted senior police officers. The fact she was a diminutive lady, and she always dressed in mourning black. She never really recovered from the death of her own husband very early on in her life. So these kind of confrontations, she was considered to be a real nuisance. And I think society took its revenge on her by airbrushing her out of history. And there's no blue plaque, there's no monument, there's no statue to Violet Vander Elst. When I'm speaking to young girls and women, my own granddaughter, who's 14 and is writing essays at school about all these things, I say, what about Violet Vander Elst? Never mind about Michelle Obama. What about Violet Vander Elst? In the hope that people will start to dig into her life. She has due respect. She has the right to be remembered, I think. And that's what I was trying to do when I wrote the story.
Tom, we haven't really touched on the issue yet. Her big campaign over many, many years, she spent fortunes or a few fortunes fighting this campaign. Can you set the scene for us? Because you always like the social history behind these stories of the day. In this case, we're talking about capital punishment, hanging back in the day, and this is what she was campaigning against. Why do you think she was so against the death penalty at that time? What was her history?
Her history, well, it was all about the sanctity of life and what she perceived to be the sanctity of life, and the fact that the Bible said, "Thou shalt not kill." Violet has a very interesting backstory. She was a very, very able woman. She was born into poverty. She was born as Violet Ann Dodge. She was literally lower working class, started working as a maidservant. And during that time, she obviously had a bit of spark about her, because she started to manufacture, of her own volition, cosmetics. Now, it's interesting because in that time, and I'm talking about the turn of the century now, I'm talking about 1900. She was born in 1882, so I'm talking about just the turn of 1900. Cosmetics were very, very expensive, and only ladies could afford cosmetics. Working class girls couldn't afford cosmetics, and so they made them themselves. And what they did was they bought lanolin, which is an animal fat, and they put little bits of perfume in it, rose water and things like that, to make face creams. They couldn't afford to buy them, so they made them. And she was particularly good at making them, and so she used to sell them to friends and started a little cottage industry while still a servant girl. So she had that sort of entrepreneurial way about her. And then Violet met and married her first husband, who was an engineer. Henry, he was much older than she was, but it was a love match. And it wasn't one of these cases where older man marries a young girl. It was a real love match, and he encouraged her to keep going and to try and perfect these cosmetics. But tragically, he died of sudden illness. He wasn't all that old, and Violet really never recovered from that. And from then on, she became interested in spiritualism. To the end of her life, she was determined that she could contact Henry in the afterlife. And everything she did after that was kind of influenced by that tremendous trauma in her early life. But instead of knocking her down, it gave her tremendous impetus to succeed in both business and succeed in her life's mission, which was the eradication of the death penalty. She saw judicial killings as being a sin against the teachings of the Bible, and she was determined to throw every ounce of energy she had and every penny of money she had into seeing the death penalty ended. And so she spent her life doing that. In between times, she invented the first brushless shaving soap. It was basically a lady's cosmetic with a little bit of soap in it. But she called it Shavex, and Shavex was an absolute revolution. Because, of course, you didn't need a brush and you didn't need all the kit and a little tin of soap. You just had this Shavex, which you rubbed on to your face and then shaved with. And it came out at the same time as the safety razor, which we're all familiar with now, but it replaced the cutthroat razor. So it was an absolute revolution. And this is where the clue comes in. She supported it with an incredibly active and very, very forward-thinking advertising campaign. She had a real eye for marketing and advertising. And so Shavex was an enormous success. And eventually she sold the brand of Shavex for, at that time, millions of pounds. And so there she was. She wasn't yet 40. She was widowed. She had all this money. What was she going to do with it? She could have lived a life of luxury, but not her. And because she was driven by this absolute abhorrence of judicial murder, of hanging, of the death penalty. And she set out on a campaign to try and get it eradicated. And she carried that on for 25 or 30 years.
It's some story, Tom, having read it. I've read it a couple of times because it's very inspiring. And I can see why you would want your family, your granddaughters, etc., to know about it. Because it's a shame that these things, and there's lots of them, that are swept aside and never really recognised until maybe years later. I wonder if a part of that airbrushing, as you call it, was due to her religious beliefs. There's no doubt that she was a bit cranky. She was a bit off the wall. She was certainly an expert at marketing herself and putting her cause on the front pages, I would imagine. I wonder if there was resentment, and we can see that in modern days as well. When someone becomes maybe too big for the boots, they tend to get shot down. You think she was a bit off the wall?
Yes, I think she was. She was undoubtedly eccentric. To put it mildly, she was eccentric. And now, there's no doubt, she would be diagnosed as suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress trauma, because she never really did recover from the death of her first husband. She married again. She married a man who worked for her as a companion thing. That's where the Vander Elst came in. That he was a Dutchman who worked at her company. I don't think the Christianity side, because remember that at that time, in the early part of the 20th century, I mean, we were a much more religious country than we are now. But I think the spiritualism, and I think the fact that she was obviously a wealthy woman who, beneath that fine veneer and the fine mourning black and the Rolls Royce, was an absolute battle axe who would take on anybody. I think it unnerved the establishment. She wasn't seen to be playing by the rules, and they didn't like that.
As you know, I've got an ongoing cause with LEAP, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, to have our drugs laws, the Misuse of Drugs Act, looked at and brought up to speed as far as the modern age is concerned. And what I'm fascinated with here, firstly, did Violet live to see the abolition of the death penalty? Did she manage to see that happen?
Yes, she did. She died in 1966, which was just the year after. There had been no hangings for quite some time, but the death penalty was still on the books, as it were. It was still in the statute, was still there. She lived to see the death penalty abolished. But again, tragically, at the time when the death penalty was abolished, there was all sorts of people got credit for, churchmen and people who had campaigned for it. But Violet didn't get mentioned. And again, I thought that was a gratuitous act of cruelty, really. Again, one of the reasons why I wanted to draw her back out to the light. But I think actually it's interesting you talk about LEAP, Simon. I think there's a lesson there for your group and for other groups who have got a cause to fight. And that is that it's a long game, but you must keep going. You must keep going. And that's the lesson from Violet Vander Elst.
Very much so. And the point I was going to make, Tom, was that she did live to see it, but you just made the point for me by pointing out that there hadn't been a death sentence or one that was carried out for a few years before the abolishment of capital punishment. And my point was that the campaigning had a social impact. It became unacceptable to the communities that she lived in and that we all live in to hang people at that time before the law was ever changed. And I think I can see that happening with our drug laws, that cannabis is becoming pretty much acceptable on our streets and by the police to a great degree that we'll discuss in the future, no doubt. And that gradually we're beginning to accept that it's a social problem and not a criminal problem, that locking people up for these things isn't working. And that's the same effect that she had and others had at that time with capital punishment, because the law had to catch up with the public interest, if you like. I'm very keen to take up with the fiscal service and with the courts in general, is that we have to look at what's in the public interest, not in the interest of politicians, not in the interest of any single individual or movement, but in the interest of us all and the communities we live in. So I think she exemplifies that for me to some degree. Did she enjoy her later life at all, or was she so wrapped up in this, Tom, that it consumed her?
In her later years, she spent all her money, basically. She was fabulously wealthy when she sold her business. She had a huge manor house in Lincolnshire, her Laxton Manor, marvellous, huge place. It's now a private school. And she decorated lavishly and she drove about the Rolls Royce. So she had a lot of money. But she wasn't bothered about material things, really. She used the Rolls Royce and she used her wealth towards a goal. And the Rolls Royce was a prop. It was interesting, and this is maybe something for you to think about in your project as well, is that she concentrated on what she considered to be worthy victims. She was particularly active advocating the abolishment of the death sentence in notorious cases. Right. So, for instance, the Ruxton murders, which we already discussed. A case that grabbed the headlines, a case where she knew there would be newspaper reporters outside the prison or outside the court, then she would be there. That wasn't because she didn't care for all the others. It's just that she realised that that was where she could have most effect.
You started this off by saying that the current demonstrations at the moment, it's No More Oil, I think, or whatever they're called, and disrupting Wimbledon, disrupting the cricket and the football and various events. And there seems to be a tipping point coming where the cause gets harmed by the actions that they take, that people start to get annoyed at what they're doing. And there's a new protest starting. Stop protesting about the oil because of the disruption. There's a fine balance there, isn't there?
Of course there is. And Violet knew this because none of Violet's protests ever disrupted the public.
Right.
She never blocked streets. She never did anything which would disrupt ordinary people going about their business because she wanted to win them over. It was common sense. What she did was she confronted authority. This little old lady in the Rolls Royce lambasting the policeman or lambasting the Home Secretary or the judge. Of course, that appealed to, a lot of ordinary people who thought, good on you, girl, go on.
And we've seen that in court, Tom, in the forensic daylight of a sheriff and jury or even a sheriff court. An old biddy comes in and she just speaks in her Glasgow or Edinburgh vernacular and calls the sheriff's son, perhaps, or something along those lines, And the whole place knows one thing for sure. She's telling the truth, and don't dare contradict her in any form.
Yeah, I mean, she was a force to be reckoned with. I mean, her standard gambit was that they didn't know she was coming, but she would roll up in the Rolls Royce and she would get out of the Rolls Royce and she would go over and confront the people at the prison gate like a banshee. And at the same time, this loudspeaker would strike up so, with the psalms. And she would also sometimes employ a brass band who would suddenly appear or 30 men with placards, sandwich boards, thou shalt not kill and all the rest of it. And so she was incredibly astute and effective in her timing. I just wish I'd been there to see one of these one of these demonstrations. I think it would have been fantastic.
This has given me lots of food for thought. And I'm now the treasurer of Leap UK. So I'm about to put in an invoice for a brass band for outside Westminster.
What she also did was she pioneered, we'd seen in America, but not here, was this business of aircraft towing banners.
Right.
And she used to have several of these aircraft towing banners flying about. And of course, she was right, because she simply said, are you a Christian person? And of course, the answer, if you were the Home Secretary, is going to be yes. The Bible says thou shalt not kill. And I mean, it was a really difficult argument to fight against. And privately, of course, a lot of them agreed with her, particularly the churchmen agreed with her. But there was a tremendous fear that the public wouldn't stand for the abolition of the death penalty. There was a belief, and again, this strikes a chord with the drugs issue just now. There was this mistaken belief that the public actually wanted harsh penalties, when in fact, the public were a lot more nuanced and a lot cleverer than that. Right. And the public had everyday life experiences, just as people have of drugs. There's very, very few people in society now who don't either have a first or second-hand experience of drugs. There was just this misunderstanding, I think, from the establishment about what the public thought about the death penalty, which is one of the reasons why, while hangings were stopped, it took something like 20 years before a politician or a political party had the courage to actually revoke the legislation.
Brilliant, Tom. It's a fantastic read. We've only touched the surface of it here, of course, but I think we've definitely got a flavour of the magnificent Violet, Vander Elst. Thanks for sharing that with us, and I'll get a wee chat with you soon about some other story, no doubt.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's been nice to talk to you. Good luck with your campaign. I think the wind is behind you. The change is coming.
All we need is a brass band and we're off and running now.
You can take a lesson from Violet, adopt her tactics, and get a Rolls Royce.
And a megaphone.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
I remember we recorded interviews, so that takes you back to Crusader. And it was an absolute nightmare, the thought of it. We thought it would change everything in the CID. All our interviews, everything were going to be tape recorded. We couldn't get our head around it at all. And this was going to be the biggest negative thing to happen. We thought detection rates would plummet. We thought the criminals were going to have a field day with it. And it turned out to be one of the best things that could ever have happened, because it made us better. It made us really interview people properly. It made us go through the procedures. And if anything, it increased not just the detection rate, the conviction rate. Because what we discovered, and the lawyers, I think they were harder to convince than anyone. They couldn't believe that people would admit things on an interview scenario, on tape, but they did.